Sehr geehrte Frau Dr. Maria Kiciuk und sehr geehrte Frau Oksana, liebe Uta Fröhlich, sehr geehrte Teilnehmende. Wir freuen uns sehr über Ihr Interesse an dieser Veranstaltung, die anlässlich des 15-jährigen Jubiläums des Dokumentationszentrums NS-Zwangsarbeit stattfindet. Es geht heute um eine ukrainische, sehr wechselvolle Familiengeschichte. Sie steht im Zusammenhang mit der Ausstellung Batterien für die Wehrmacht, Zwangsarbeit bei Pertrix 1939 bis 1945, die wir von 2015 bis 2018 im Dokumentationszentrum gezeigt haben. Diese Ausstellung hatte eine längere Entstehungsgeschichte. Sie erinnern sich vielleicht an den Dokumentarfilm Das Schweigen der Quanz, der 2007 im deutschen Fernsehen gezeigt wurde. Er machte auf den Zwangsarbeitseinsatz von rund 50.000 Menschen aufmerksam, die in den Unternehmen des Familienkonzerns zur Arbeit gezwungen wurden. Die heftige Debatte im Anschluss an den Film machte deutlich, dass sich zahlreiche große Unternehmen zwar am Entschädigungsfonds 2000 beteiligt haben, wenn auch nicht immer ganz freiwillig, dass aber die Aufarbeitung der eigenen Verantwortung für den Zwangsarbeitseinsatz in vielen Fällen ausgeblieben war, gerade im Fall der Familienunternehmen. Dieser Film gab den Anstoß für zum einen eine umfangreiche Studie über die Unternehmensgeschichte und auch für mehrere große Projekte bei uns im Dokumentationszentrum NS-Zwangsarbeit, die von der Johanna-Quandt-Stiftung gefördert wurden. Die Verbindung zum Dokumentationszentrum ist die zum Quandt gehörende Batteriefabrik Pertrix in Berlin-Schöneweide. Bei Pertrix mussten bei der Batterieproduktion unter gefährlichen und gesundheitsschädlichen Bedingungen rund 2000 Menschen arbeiten. Untergebracht waren sie in firmeneigenen Lagern. Pertrix setzte alle Gruppen von Zwangsarbeitern und Zwangsarbeiterinnen ein. Berliner Jüdinnen und Juden im Rahmen des sogenannten geschlossenen Arbeitseinsatzes, Kriegsgefangene, zivile Zwangsarbeiter und Zwangsarbeiterinnen aus West- und Osteuropa und KZ-Häftlinge. Die meisten waren Frauen, abgesehen von den Kriegsgefangenen. Ein Teil der weiblichen KZ-Häftlinge war im Lager in Schöneweide untergebracht, wo sich heute das Dokumentationszentrum befindet. Auch ganze Familien sind nach Berlin zur Zwangsarbeit bei Pertrix verschleppt worden. Dazu gehörte auch die Familie Kocur, das heißt die Eltern von Maria Kiciuk mit ihren 3 Kindern. Uns war im Rahmen der Vorbereitung der Ausstellung sehr wichtig, mehr über die bei der Batteriefabrik eingesetzten Zwangsarbeiter und Zwangsarbeiterinnen herauszufinden und möglichst noch Überlebende zu finden. Dass dies in vielen Fällen gelungen ist, ist der Kuratorin Uta Fröhlich zu verdanken. Sie hat nicht nur die Namen und biografische Angaben von rund 1700 ehemaligen Zwangsarbeiterinnen und Zwangsarbeitern recherchiert und in einer Datenbank zusammengetragen, sondern sie hat auch Überlebende gefunden und Interviews geführt, unter anderem mit Maria Kiciuk und ihrem Bruder Theodor Kocur. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Uta Fröhlich, die mittlerweile bei der Gedenkstätte Stille Helden arbeitet, heute die Moderation des Gesprächs übernimmt und ich übergebe an dich, liebe Uta.
Vielen Dank, liebe Christine, für die Einladung und für die netten Worte. Ich möchte jetzt als erstes gerne unseren Gast vorstellen, Maria Kiciuk, geborene Kocur. Sie ist geboren in einem Dorf im Westen der Ukraine und nach der Flucht mit ihrer Familie vor der Roten Armee Richtung Westen ist sie in die Zwangsarbeit geraten mit ihrer Familie. Das heißt, sie wurden von den Deutschen verschleppt, und zwar erst nach Linz in ein Zwangsarbeiterlager und dann nach Berlin in das Pertrix-Lager in der Adlershofer Straße. Ich werde nachher noch ein bisschen darüber berichten. 1949 ist die Familie gemeinsam in die USA emigriert, wo Maria Kiciuk studiert hat und promoviert hat. Linguistik, sie ist Doktor der Linguistik. Sie hat Jaroslav Kiciuk geheiratet, der ebenfalls aus der Ukraine stammt, und die beiden haben 6 Kinder zusammen bekommen. Eine Tochter sitzt neben Maria, Oksana. Sie wird heute Maria unterstützen. Heute lebt Maria Kiciuk in Yonkers im Staat New York. Maria wird jetzt ihre Lebensgeschichte vortragen, einen Erinnerungsbericht, den sie geschrieben hat, beziehungsweise Oksana wird sie dabei unterstützen und wird ihren Erinnerungsbericht vortragen. Danach werde ich dann einen kurzen Bericht noch abgeben, und zwar werde ich erzählen, wie wir auf die Familie Kocur gestoßen sind, wie dieser Kontakt entstanden ist und ein bisschen was zum historischen Hintergrund der Zwangsarbeit bei Pertrix sagen, soweit es die Familie betrifft. Und danach werde ich Maria und Oksana ein paar Fragen stellen, und Sie können aber gerne auch als Publikum Fragen stellen, und diese bitte benutzen Sie dafür den Chat. Sie können Ihre Fragen in den Chat schreiben, und ich werde dann wahrscheinlich auswählen müssen, weil ich denke, das werden mehrere sein. Und wir müssen sehen, wie die Zeit reicht. Auf jeden Fall schreiben Sie Ihre Fragen in den Chat, und ich werde die dann an Frau Kiciuk weitergeben. Jetzt bitte ich Maria und Oksana, ihr Mikrofon anzuschalten und mit ihrem Vortrag zu beginnen.
Guten Abend, gnädige Frauen und Herren. I'm honored to be here today. 76 years ago, I was in Berlin, and my family worked at the Pertrix factory. As my story is about my family's experiences, especially during World War II. My daughter Oksana is going to read the story since I have some problems with my voice. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell my story. My life story begins in Western Ukraine, in a small, peaceful village surrounded by low-lying mountains. Our family consisted of my parents and 6 children. My parents were farmers, so we all worked very hard. Despite the hard work, I remember my early childhood as a happy one. But all that was about to change. My parents were barely 17 years old when they left Ukraine to escape poverty in their homeland. They met in Yonkers, New York, and were married in a Ukrainian church after immigrating to the United States in 1910. My oldest sister, Katrusia, was born in Yonkers. Some 40 years later, 4 of their children were married in the same Ukrainian church. Life was good in the United States. My parents worked hard and saved money, but good fortune could not outweigh my mother's homesickness, so they decided to go back to Ukraine. Now they had enough money to buy property in a neighboring village. Little did they know that improving their life would make them a target. In the fall of 1939, World War II started, and the Soviet communist regime took over Western Ukraine as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was a treaty between Stalin and Hitler. So for the first 2 years of the war, Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union were allies. To this day, Russia is attempting to hide this fact by alleging that World War II started in June of 1941. By the time the war started, my oldest sister Katrusia was married and lived in a city quite a distance from our village. My oldest brother Mikola and my sister Anna were in a boarding school. My brother Theodor, my sister Sonia, and I were still at home with my parents. I was 6 years old at the time. We lived in Western Ukraine, where my family, it was now part of the Soviet Union, or what we later referred to as the Evil Empire. One day in December of 1939, communist officials came to our home. They told my parents it was no longer our home. The house and all our property now belonged to the state. There was nothing we could do. We had to leave. Fortunately, my cousin took us in. It wasn't easy for him. His house was small. He had his own family, and now 5 more of us. Very soon, we understood how lucky we were to have been thrown out of the house. Our fate could have been much worse. One night in February of 1940, in the middle of winter, when the cold was unbearable and the snow was waist deep, my parents heard loud voices outside, speaking in Russian, which was unusual in Western Ukraine at the time. My father was sure that they came to get him. The Soviet authorities often arrested people at night, but we were not on the list that night. That night, they took our cousin's neighbor and his family to Siberia. That same night, they took thousands of Ukrainians and shipped them to the gulags, where most of them perished from lack of food, shelter, and slave labor. Still fearful that he might be arrested, my father decided to go to my uncle Mikhailo, who lived in a different part of the village. So he plodded through the snow in the middle of the night. As he approached the house, he saw lights burning and heard people crying. That night, my uncle and his family were taken to Siberia. We never saw or heard from his family again. From then on, people in our village were afraid to help us. They began to understand that in the eyes of the Soviet authorities, we were considered to be enemies of the people. This was not only because we were somewhat better off, but more importantly, because my parents were more educated and knew how people lived in the United States and could refute Soviet propaganda. No one was allowed to help enemies of the people. Our cousin was now afraid to provide shelter for us. We had to leave. My parents had to decide what to do next to save their family. They placed each child with a different relative in a different village or city. I lived with my married sister's parents-in-law. We later found out that the Soviet authorities also confiscated my sister's house and property so that her family became homeless. My father found work far away from our village. My mother didn't have a place to live, so she walked from village to village and spent a few days with each child. The Soviet communist occupation was followed by the Nazi invasion. In June 1941, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union and by the end of November occupied all of Ukraine. As soon as the Soviets left Western Ukraine, my family went back to our village and reoccupied our house. We didn't ask anyone for permission, and no one told us we couldn't go back. We now had to work even harder than before to make the farm functional again. In order to support their military expansion, the Nazis implemented Lebensraum, a policy of conquering territory for German youth. In the process, they set out to eliminate Jews and turn Slavs into slaves. Jews and Slavic people were considered to be Untermenschen. The Nazis did not want an independent Ukraine. They imprisoned the leaders of the independence movement and sent them to concentration camps where many of them perished. Others were assassinated by Soviet agents. The Nazis needed food and raw materials and took as much as they could, creating food shortages, especially in the cities. They did not allow people to bring food from villages. My sister Katrusia and her 2 children spent one summer with us because they lived in a city and didn't have enough food. The man I later met and married tried to help his family. He got a job as a manager of a mill so he could bring some grain to his family. Because bringing food into cities was forbidden, he had to get off the train 2 stops before reaching his destination and walk, avoiding main roads so as not to be caught. The Nazis needed workers. They would round up young people and ship them to forced labor camps. More than 2 million Ukrainians suffered that fate, and my brother Mykola was one of them. For many years, we did not know what happened to him. It was only much later we found out that he had been taken by the Nazis after the war and then handed over to the Soviet authorities as part of repatriation. The Soviets sent Mykola to Kolyma, a remote region in Siberia beyond the Arctic Circle, known for its harsh climate and its gulag labor camps, where the mortality reached 80% and where millions of prisoners were exterminated during the Stalin regime. There he spent almost 10 years working in the gold mines as a slave laborer. He was granted amnesty during the Khrushchev era, but was not allowed to return to Ukraine. Young people in Ukraine tried to find a way to avoid being taken to Germany as forced laborers. Many of them joined the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was formed in 1942 and fought against both the Nazis and the Soviets. My future husband was one of these freedom fighters. For 3 years, he lived in the forest, fighting for Ukraine's independence. In the summer of 1947, 2 years after the war ended, a group of about 300 freedom fighters were given the task of reaching the American zone in Germany in order to inform the free world that Ukraine was continuing its fight for independence. It took my husband and his group about 4 months to finally reach the free world. They hid in the woods during the day and walked at night. They ate whatever they could find in the fields. My husband said that the last 2 or 3 weeks, all they had to eat were grapes. Some of them died along the way, but most of those who had set out from Ukraine reached the American zone and were able to tell their story. My family left Ukraine in June 30th, 1944, as the Red Army was approaching once again. One morning, and I remember it vividly, I woke up very early and heard my parents whispering. They were trying to decide what to do. I was only 11 years old, but I dreaded what might happen if we stayed. Fortunately, my parents decided to leave. It was not an easy decision. My parents were farmers, owned property, farm animals, and a nice house. We had no place to go and no specific plans. Yet the decision was made to leave everything and face the unknown in a foreign land. They took a wagon and 2 horses and left our home and village, not realizing that it would be forever. There were 6 of us, my parents, my brother Theodor, my sisters Anna and Sonia, and I. My parents tried to let my sister Katrusia know that we were leaving, but that proved too difficult to do. It was summer, so we slept in the wagon. Occasionally, we would find an abandoned house and stay there for a day or 2. We kept moving west before the approaching front. We were not the only ones trying to escape. Thousands of Ukrainians were leaving their homes and their belongings in an effort to flee, so groups of caravans were formed. Our journey to freedom ended abruptly when the Nazis confiscated our carriage and horses, put us on freight trains, and took us to a forced labor camp, first in Linz, Austria, and then we were transported to Berlin. My sister Anna was put to work in a restaurant in Linz. She was not with us when they took us to Berlin and was left behind. It was only after the war that my father found her through a newspaper ad, and my cousin brought her illegally from Austria to Germany. Part of our family was reunited once again. I don't remember much about my life in the forced labor camp in Berlin. I remember that I was always cold and that the food was bad, some kind of broth and a piece of stale bread. There was no privacy of any kind. Several families slept in a large room full of bunk beds. I also remember being afraid of the air raids. 2.5 million Ukrainians worked as forced Nazi laborers. Ukrainians from Western Ukraine were forced to wear the symbol P and were often mislabeled as Poles. Ukrainians from Eastern Ukraine had to wear the symbol Ost and were mislabeled as Russians. Unfortunately, this misinformation often continues to the present time. The Red Army was approaching Berlin, and we had to flee once again. Somehow, my father, God bless his soul, found a way to save his family. Early in the morning of February 22nd, 1945, possibly during an air raid, as the laborers were headed to work, our family crept through a hole in the fence and left the camp. Miraculously, we escaped just a few days before the camp was bombed and just a few weeks before the Red Army occupied Berlin. We took a train and headed south in the direction of Bavaria. We stopped in Pforzheim, which later became the American zone, and there we worked for various farmers during the planting and harvesting season. We joined a displaced persons camp as soon as the Americans began to organize them. We felt that we had finally overcome all the obstacles and were now safe, but it wasn't so. we had to overcome one more hurdle, the forced repatriation to the Soviet Union. There was an agreement reached by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at the Yalta Conference that all former Soviet citizens had to go back to the Soviet Union with no regard to their individual wishes. Soviet agents were roaming the camps and trying to ensure compliance. My brother remembers that our parents were taken into custody in an effort to force us to go back. Thousands of Ukrainians were handed over to Soviet authorities, and hundreds committed suicide rather than being forced to go back. Finally, the forced repatriation policy was stopped. We stayed in Germany for an additional 4 years. We were assigned to a displaced persons camp in Erlangen, a beautiful city, not heavily damaged in the war because of its many hospitals and universities. My father worked there for the American Army and served as an interpreter when needed. I have fond memories of my life in the displaced persons camp. We had regular church services and a school which I attended. We had a scout organization and all kinds of activities that I was involved in. We also had a choir, which I belonged to since I liked to sing. In 1948, things began to change. People were leaving the camp and going to different countries. In the fall, there were not enough students to form a class I could attend. So during my last year in Germany, I attended a German Hochschule. It was not easy for me because all the subjects were in German. I was excused from Scout and other activities and devoted all my time to studying. I am sorry I didn't keep in touch with any of my high school friends, but in the United States, I was overwhelmed with new responsibilities and had no time to think about anything else. The United States became our new home, and we are most grateful for that. The freedoms that non-totalitarian and non-communist countries enjoy should not be taken for granted. We have often wondered why we were spared. Was it because the repatriation policy was finally terminated? Was it because my father spoke some English and his sister in the United States was ready to sponsor us? Was it perhaps that the person in charge of the camp was a kind-hearted person? This we will never know. But once again, our family was saved. My siblings and I considered it a miracle that we somehow survived the war, as well as the Soviet and Nazi occupations. This was our family home that my father purchased in 1951. We were happy to be reunited with our sister Katrusia and our brother Mykola when Ukraine gained independence in 1991, some 50 years after seeing them. Unfortunately, both our parents died before ever seeing their two oldest children again. As a newly independent country, Ukraine's borders opened up and I was able to return for a visit. My husband, who made the trip with two of our daughters, finally met with his brother, who he hadn't seen in over 50 years. On this trip in 1992, when visiting my village, my husband and daughters came across a sobering scene. The village was having a funeral for the hundreds of victims of the Soviet regime. Bodies that had been thrown into a pit were dug up, placed in caskets, and properly buried. According to villagers, another 800 or so bodies were buried under the train tracks. Similar funeral processions were held throughout Ukraine. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, people had been too afraid to even mention that any of this happened. My family, my brothers, and both my sister's families are doing well in the United States. Here we are at a family reunion in 1999. I'm proud to say that my children are fluent not only in English, but also in Ukrainian. My life story is similar to that of many of my countrymen. It is also closely intertwined with the history of my birth country, Ukraine, oppressed by the repressive regimes of two terrible dictators of the 20th century, Stalin and Hitler. Professor Timothy Snyder, a Yale University historian, states that during World War II, Ukraine suffered more losses than any other European country. If you add that to the losses Ukraine suffered during the Holodomor, the famine genocide perpetrated by Stalin in 1932-1933, which amounted to millions, the losses are staggering. In his speech to the Bundestag on Germany's historical responsibility, Professor Snyder stresses that Germany's responsibility is primarily to Ukraine and not to Russia. All of Ukraine was overrun by the Nazis for the duration of the war, whereas only 5% of Russia was occupied and only for a short period of time. Thus, Ukraine was exploited by the Nazis much more than Russia was. Appeal to the German government. We support Ukraine's ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnik's appeal to the German government to erect a monument and documentation center dedicated to the millions of Ukrainians who slaved for the Nazis or died at the hands of the Nazis. I'm going to turn it over to my mother now.
In conclusion, I would like to thank Dr. Glauning and the Communication Centrum for giving me the opportunity to share the story of my family. Thank you. Dankeschön. Дякую.
Vielen Dank, Maria und Oksana, für diesen interessanten Vortrag. Und wir werden nun, ich werde jetzt weiterfahren, wie vorhin angekündigt, mit ein bisschen Hintergrund. Ich werde jetzt erstmal ein bisschen darüber erzählen, wie wir die Familie Kocur gefunden haben. Und dazu habe ich auch eine kleine PowerPoint vorbereitet, wenn die jetzt bitte eingeblendet werden könnte. Die erste Slide. Das ist nicht das erste Bild. Ja, genau, das ist das erste Bild. Wir sehen hier eine historische Ansicht der Pertrix-Fabrik. Die ist nicht weit von hier vom Dokumentationszentrum entfernt, etwa 1 Kilometer an der Spree, wie man sieht. Hier wurden Batterien gefertigt. Heute heißt diese Straße Simon-Bürgel-Weg und die Fabrik steht auch tatsächlich heute noch. 2013, als ich Mitarbeiterin des Dokumentationszentrums NS-Zwangsarbeit war, war ich beschäftigt mit der Forschung zu Zwangsarbeit für Pertrix. Ich war, wie Christine Glauning ja vorhin schon erzählt hat, ich war auf der Suche nach ehemaligen Zwangsarbeiterinnen und Zwangsarbeitern und nach deren Namen. Und es gab bereits Listen, es waren schon Listen hier vorhanden aus dem Archiv des Internationalen Suchdienstes in Bad Arolsen, heute die Arolsen Archives. Und diese Listen habe ich als erstes ausgewertet. Das waren lange Namenslisten und die Namen und Daten habe ich in eine Datenbank eingegeben. Und hier fanden sich auch tatsächlich die ersten Hinweise auf eine, ich wusste noch nicht genau, ob Familie, auf einzelne Personen mit dem Namen Kocur oder Kocur in verschiedenen Schreibweisen. Bitte die zweite Slide. Hier haben wir eine dieser Listen, und zwar wurde die erstellt im Auftrag der Alliierten nach dem Krieg. Und diese Liste hier wurde erstellt vom Polizeirevier in Niederschöneweide. Und sie zeigt Namen von Sowjetbürgern, die im Lager Adlershofer Straße registriert worden sind. Das Lager Adlershofer Straße lag genau gegenüber der Pertrix-Fabrik. Und hier finden wir, ich habe das mal markiert, 2 Personen namens Theodor Kocur. Hier ist es mit S geschrieben. Der eine 51 Jahre alt, der andere 17 Jahre alt, und beide kommen aus der gleichen Region in der Ukraine. Da hatte ich schon den Verdacht, dass es möglicherweise Vater und Sohn sein könnten. Dann die nächste Slide bitte. Hier eine zweite Liste. Diese Liste ist erstellt worden, auch im Auftrag der Alliierten, allerdings von der Firma selbst, von Pertrix. Und wir finden hier erneut den einen Theodor Kocur, diesmal also auch wieder mit S, den anderen dieses Mal mit Z geschrieben, weiter unten, und oben drüber, direkt über ihm, Anna, auch mit Z geschrieben, Kocur. Und alle 3 sind am selben Tag bei Pertrix angekommen, am 19. Januar 1945. Da lag dann der Verdacht nahe, dass sie auch zusammengehören, trotz der verschiedenen Schreibweisen, und dass eben Anna die Ehefrau ist des einen und die Mutter des anderen. Ein weiteres Dokument passt dazu, dieses Mal ein Schreiben des Arbeitsamtes an die Firma Pertrix. Da geht es um die Umsetzung von Ostarbeiterinnen mit ihren Kindern von der Firma Ambibut zu Pertrix am 18. Januar 1945. Und hier ist auf der zweiten Seite, auch wieder rot markiert, Anna Kocur mit Z geschrieben, erneut vermerkt, und dahinter 2K, das bedeutet 2 Kinder, deren Namen sind nicht angegeben. Ja, da wussten wir dann schon, dass es noch weitere Kinder geben muss. Spätere Recherchen nach dem Namen Kocur oder Kocur in den Arolsen Archives, also wir sind dann nochmal hingefahren und haben dann anhand der Namen nochmal nach weiteren Dokumenten gesucht. Dann haben wir noch mehr gefunden, und zwar unter anderem das nächste Bild, eine Personalkarteikarte für den jüngeren Theodor Kocur, sehen wir jetzt hier. Es gibt auch noch 2 weitere für den Vater und auch für die Mutter. Und man kann hier, also das ist wirklich die Personalkartei von Pertrix, die eben größtenteils erhalten geblieben ist und in Arolsen nach Namen recherchierbar war. Und was interessant ist, bei all diesen 3 Personalkarteikarten stand oben drüber, handschriftlich vermerkt, wir sehen das jetzt hier links über dieser Nummer 286, also geflüchtet am 22. Februar und Fluchtmeldung am 10. März. Also das war 1945. Also wir wussten jetzt, die 3 sind auf jeden Fall zusammen, möglicherweise auch mit den 2 angegebenen Kindern, am 22. Februar 1945 aus dem Lager geflohen, was der Lagerleitung erst mit Verzögerung aufgefallen ist. Dann gibt es noch weitere Dokumente aus der Nachkriegszeit. Wir haben gefunden Meldekarten aus Forchheim in Bayern, Registrierungskarten aus dem DP-Lager und dann dieses Dokument auch noch. Und zwar ist das die Passagierliste der USAT General Ballou, die am 7. August 1949 von Bremerhaven abgelegt hat Richtung New York. Und hier finden wir 6 Personen namens Kocur, jetzt durchgängig mit C geschrieben, wir sehen wieder Theodor den Vater, Theodor den Sohn, Anna die Mutter, Sophia und Maria, die jüngeren Töchter, und dann auch noch Anna Kocur. Wir haben das vorhin im Vortrag von Maria und Oksana gehört, dass die Tochter Anna erst später dazu kam. Und die sind hier alle auf dieser Shipping-List vermerkt. Und das Ziel war Yonkers, New York, also eine Adresse in Yonkers im Staat New York. Wir wissen also, eine 6-köpfige Familie, damit schließt sich da der Kreis zu den anderen Dokumenten und wir wissen jetzt, wer alles zu dieser Familie gehört. Als nächstes habe ich versucht, über das Internet herauszufinden, ob es noch Angehörige dieser Familie gibt in den USA, und tatsächlich wurde ich auch fündig in Yonkers und habe einen Brief geschrieben, und dann kam auch ziemlich schnell ein langer und sehr netter Brief von Maria Kiciuk zurück, die mir ausführlich über ihre Familiengeschichte berichtet hat. Und 2014 konnte ich dann nach Yonkers reisen und die Interviews führen mit Maria und ihrem Bruder Theodor. Und die ganzen Erkenntnisse, die wir jetzt gewonnen haben aus den Recherchen in den Archiven und dann auch aus den Interviews und die Dokumente, das ist alles eingeflossen dann in die Ausstellung Batterien für die Wehrmacht. Und besonders haben wir uns gefreut, dass dann zur Eröffnung 2015 die Familie angereist ist, nicht nur Maria und ihr Bruder, sondern auch noch eine ganze große Gruppe aus der Familie, ich glaube 12 Personen waren sie. Jetzt haben wir noch ein Bild, habe ich noch ein Bild vorbereitet, und zwar sehen wir hier jetzt nochmal ein Luftbild von 1945 der Alliierten. Ich wollte Ihnen das zeigen, weil wir kein wirkliches Foto vom Lager Adlershofer Straße haben, aber auf diesem Luftbild kann man zumindest erkennen, wo es sich befunden hat. Also Sie sehen jetzt hier wieder die Fabrik in der Mitte und links davon auch gelb markiert 3 Baracken, das ist das Lager Sedanstraße 53 und rechts von der Fabrik im Dreieck angeordnet das Lager Adlershofer Straße, in dem die Familie Kocur untergebracht war. Ja, so viel dazu. Jetzt würde ich gerne weitermachen mit den Fragen und werde dafür jetzt auch auf Englisch umswitchen, damit wir direkt im Gespräch sein können. Maria and Oksana, I want to ask you a few questions that I prepared, and wenn jemand noch im Chat Fragen stellen möchte, bitte nur zu. If you want to ask questions in the chat, please use the chat function, and I will ask questions to Maria and Oksana. My first question: before you received my letter and we met, were you aware that your parents and brother had done forced labor? In Berlin, did you know that you were in a forced labor camp, actually?
I think that I was aware that my family was in a place not of their choice, that we actually had no freedom. We couldn't make any decisions on our own, that the accommodations were of a poor standard and the food was bad. I also believe that we all felt the humiliation and the feeling of being an Untermensch. But now, when I think about it, when I try to analyze my feelings at that time, I realize that even though the conditions were bad, and again, we felt that we were not treated rightly, I was somehow protected from an even greater evil, and that was the Soviet Union. I always felt that the immediate danger came from the Soviet Union because I remembered what happened to us. I remember the day when we were thrown out of the house. I remember the night when my uncle was taken to Siberia, and I remember the night when we heard Russian voices outside of our windows, and when they took our cousins' neighbors to Siberia. So all of that kind of stayed with me. There was another incident that was ingrained in my mind. When my family had to divide the family and had to send them to different relatives in different places, I stayed with my sisters, my married sisters' parents-in-law. They lived through a terrible nightmare in 1939, when the Soviets first came to Western Ukraine. A group of agents, or perhaps soldiers, came to their house, gathered the family, and were about to shoot them. But an officer intervened and the family was spared. However, their youngest son, who was about in his late teens or early 20s, was so frightened that he lost his sanity. So he would stay in bed all day long, but once in a while, he would get up and just throw whatever he could find. He would start throwing things. So everybody was afraid of him, and they would send me to give him his meals because they were hoping that he would not harm a child. So for all these reasons, and because of all these memories, which kind of haunted me, I felt that I was relatively safe in a forced labor camp.
Yes.
Add something?
No.
Okay, I have one more question about your brother Mikola. You told us that he was also forced to work for the Germans, to do forced labor for the Germans. Do you know where that was and what he had to do? And how did you find out? He told you when you met him in 1991, I think?
Actually, we still know very little about my brother Mikola. In about 1970s, we found out that he was alive, and we actually started corresponding with him indirectly through some relatives, maybe even some relatives in Poland. We never talked about what happened to him and how he landed up in a gulag later on. So, but when we went to Berlin in 2015, his daughter Larissa came to join us.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
And we thought we would find out something, but she knew nothing. it turns out that even his adult children didn't know what he went through. Now, at this time, his grandson and his wife live in Yonkers, New York. But again, they don't know their grandfather's story. So we couldn't really find out about it. People in the Soviet Union learned to be very reticent about their life and about what the experiences they had to experience.
But how did you find out that he worked also for the Germans?
This we know. I don't really know if he know it from him directly, or maybe from my sister who lived in Ukraine. Maybe he confided in her. I don't really remember how he found out.
But he didn't tell you what he did and where he worked?
No, nothing about it. He never talked about it.
Okay, and when you traveled to Berlin in 2015 with Ted and your half of your family for the opening of the Pertrix exhibition, did this trip change something for you and for your family to see the Pertrix family? Did, for example, memories came back or something like this?
It was a wonderful trip, and we were all actually elated to get the invitation. My brother, my two sisters who couldn't go, who else? My children and myself. Because first of all, what struck us was the great care with which we were what? We were treated, yes, we were treated in Berlin. But first, let me start at the beginning. The fact that Miss Frühling came to Yonkers, New York, the fact that she held an interview with my brother and myself, and the fact that it was videotaped, then the invitation itself to the opening of the Pertrix exhibition and the beautiful ceremony in Red City Hall. Maybe you want to take over. And the welcoming. The welcoming remarks by Dr. Browning, head of the Nazi forced labor Pertrix exhibition and the documentation center and other officials. That was kind of heartwarming. It showed us that we, the former Untermenschen, were actually treated as decent human beings and even welcomed as former Nazi laborers. So in a way, it showed us that Germany was ready to accept and to open this dark chapter of its history and make amends. we were also shown the Pertrix family. I'm sorry, we were also shown the Pertrix factory.
Yeah.
And that opened painful memories because so many people, so many innocent people, including my family, suffered there and worked there as Nazi forced laborers. But all of that showed us that Germany was ready to accept its responsibility. At the same time, it opened some wounds for us. Why wasn't the Soviet Union and today's Russia ready to follow suit? Why didn't they ever acknowledge all the atrocities, all the human rights abuses? In fact, they're continuing to commit aggression against Ukraine and other nations. So for us, that part, the part of the Nazi experience, that we can forget. And so there is a feeling of getting over it and being able to forget about it.
Okay, Maria, we have some questions in the chat, and I will try to. One is already answered, I think, but I will try to ask some more of these questions.
Can Oksana add something?
I just want to add about the experience of my siblings and my cousins.
Yeah.
We went in 2015 to visit the documentation center. What a memorable experience it was for us. It was very emotional for us to walk in the footsteps of my grandparents and my parents and to see what they went through. And I think you opened up a lot of doors and opened the floodgates to what happened, because we really didn't know all of that. And because of this, we learned so much of the history of what happened. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, I have one question about, I will just read it, from Anna. Thank you very much for this very moving event with incredible personal stories placed in a historical context. It is also very special since Dr. Kiciuk was my fourth grade teacher at St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic School in Yonkers, and her daughter was a classmate of mine there. I was wondering whether a memoir is in the plans. The presentation with photos was outstanding and can serve as a foundation for a memoir. The painful stories need to be widely disseminated. Difficult word. Can you?
There's a memoir in the word. This is from Anya Bogner.
Well, this is my memoir.
You can work on it.
Yeah, but thank you, Anya.
And she writes, Dr. Kiciuk knows me as Anja Bobiak. Yes. Okay, we have one more question. Mary tells us, thank you for sharing your story. My mother was also from Western Ukraine and taken for forced labor. She rarely spoke about this. And one other person asks the same. Did you talk before coming to Berlin? Did you talk in the family about what happened?
Not really, not really. I guess we kind of tried to forget about it. And also there are other concerns here, new concerns, so no.
Okay, we could read more questions from the chat, but it's already 8 o'clock and I think we have to finish now. And I have just one last question. I just wanted to ask you that in the meantime, the story of your family has not only been shown in our exhibition Batteries for the Wehrmacht, but also is part of the recently opened exhibition in the Documentation Center, Displacement, Expulsion, Reconciliation at the Anhalter Bahnhof in Berlin. What does that fact that your family history is thematized in 2 exhibitions now, what does that fact mean for you?
Well, actually, we are very glad that our story gets an additional audience, because I feel it's not just my story, nor is it the story of just my family. It is the story of millions of Ukrainians who went through the same experiences. I hope that young people will read Maria's stories and will learn something from it. I hope that they will understand that we should not condone totalitarian regimes and dictators, because they will just continue doing their evil work. So whenever there are abuses, human rights abuses, I think we should step in and try to defend freedom, try to defend our rights, because after all, we are or should be decent human beings.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think we have to stop now. I just see there's one more question about how to start research about parents' past, for example. How to start research. If we wanted to research our parents' past, how do we start? This is a question to the Documentation Center. So I think if you have questions to the Documentation Center, how to do research, for example, just write an email to the Documentation Center and they will answer you how to do. So I think it was a really nice evening, and I want to thank everybody, and I do it now in German again. Ich möchte gerne nochmal dem Publikum danken für die Aufmerksamkeit und auch die interessanten Fragen, und ich möchte natürlich auch Oksana danken, dass sie Maria unterstützt hat und auch dem Rest der Familie, der im Hintergrund an der Technik mitgewirkt hat. Den Übersetzerinnen Christina Lange und Silvia Schreiber möchte ich danken. und dem Team des Dokumentationszentrums, vor allem Lena Sommerfeld und Kai Kufeke und allen anderen hier im Hintergrund. Und natürlich vor allen anderen möchte ich dir, Maria, danken dafür, dass du deine Lebensgeschichte hier mit uns geteilt hast. Bitte bleiben Sie alle gesund und hoffentlich sehen wir Sie bald wieder bei einer Veranstaltung in echt. Vielen Dank.
Vielen Dank. Дякую.